Greetings, dear sword friends. Today we'll take a look at a relatively new offering at Cold Steel, the competition cutting sword released in 2020. This is a long overdue review. I got this sword a year ago and recorded most of the cutting sessions and review footage around that time when I first launched my channel with a review of another competition cutting sword by Victor Berbicuch, designed by Purple Heart Armory. I released a cutting montage using this sword on Facebook. Lots of viewers have requested a full review of the sword by Cold Steel, yet I've held off this review and got onto other swords until now. It's fitting that at the 1-year anniversary of my sword review channel's launch, it has come full circle that I've come back to review another competition cutting sword. I want to thank all of you for giving me the kind support that a content creator needs and values tremendously. For this review, I'll change the format slightly. I'll talk over my old footage and hopefully make a more concise case for the sword, as I do believe this sword is more oriented at the utilitarian appeal towards historical European martial arts practitioners and cutting enthusiasts. Long story short, the sword seemed to have a more limited stock as more of a complementary piece to Cold Steel's regular medieval sword offerings, the Italian longsword, the German longsword, and the hand-and-a-half sword, all of which are made by a contract forge in China called the Huano Forge, also known in the West as Dynasty Forge, for their adequate distal taper, excellent cross-section, edge geometry, and blade polish, even though at times they suffer from quality control issues over the hilt integrity, i.e. loose crossguards and pommels. This sword does not suffer the same issues, yet at the same time doesn't share the common positive traits either, and we're going to find out why. When I laid my hands on this sword, the proportions and aesthetics did impress me, as it diverges quite a bit from the usual Oakeshott Type 18C and Type 12A we see in competition cutting. The long grip combined with the rare type of pommel came out as a positive in terms of handling. The sword is a decent representation of the broader variant of the Type 18 sword, despite its short length. However, this sword felt somewhat familiar at the time, and I seemed to have seen it somewhere. Soon I realized it was a revision of a discontinued model by Windlass called the Arbedo sword, based off an original piece now on exhibit at Metropolitan Museum in New York. The reproduction of that sword by Windlass isn't particularly faithful to the original in several ways. First of all, the blade is 3/4 inch longer. Secondly, true to almost all Windlass swords, there is zero distal taper. The blade features a 3.5mm uniform thickness, and then there's the prominent central ridge on the original missing from the reproduction. Lastly, the wheel pommel doesn't replicate the original's geometry particularly well. Still, during its limited run, it was one of the popular models due to its affordability and arguably still handsome look and acceptable handling characteristics. It's a common practice for Cold Steel to take over old models from its contract forges and make them their own design after some modifications to suit their sensibility of swords. One example is their German longsword, that is just Dynasty Forge's duelist model having a larger crossguard in the side ring. What Cold Steel has done to the Arbedo sword's design is scaling up the sword overall, including a grip 2 inches or 5 centimeters longer, a blade 1.5 inches or 4 centimeters longer, and 0.5 centimeters broader at the base. Last but not least, they changed the wheel pommel into a hybrid between scentstopper and fishtail pommel to improve the ergonomics for the offhand. This gives a whopping 9.5 inches gripping space, ample for both hands to maximize the leverage and control. They also seem to have intentionally introduced a moderate amount of distal taper to the blade. This is a positive change on the mass distribution on the blade and would theoretically benefit the handling of the sword. More on that later. One trait standing out is the flexibility of the blade due to its overall thinness, which is noted in the product marketing video of Cold Steel and promoted as a feature that improves the resilience of the sword. In practice, I find this making the cut more unpredictable, as it tends to start flexing and vibrating even prior to the blade making contact with the target if you change direction midway. Without further ado, let's look at some cutting footage. Starting from 6 basic cuts in Germanic and Italian traditions, followed by 5 meisterhau or master cuts in Germanic traditions. What I want you to pay attention to are, number 1, how the short blade length and the point of percussion closer to the hilt affect my stance and posture to step closer to the target. Number 2 is how the blade starts flexing and vibrating even prior to the blade making contact with the target, and how that potentially would negatively impact the performance. So this sword came with a secondary bevel and mediocre sharpness. After giving its edges a brief honing, it cuts rather well, easier than cold steel Italian longsword and handweight Tinker Pierce bastard sword. As those swords feature a slender blade profile, so they rely more on their blade rigidity and good edge geometry, that is, a very flat ground diamond cross section, to cut well. This competition cutting sword, having a very broad blade, even after tapering down in the profile, is still relatively wide near the point of percussion. With the flat ground primary bevel, it slices through targets with minimal effort when the edge alignment is adequate. But due to the comparatively floppy blade, when you change angles during the maneuver, it starts to flex and vibrates even before making contact with the target, and sometimes botches the cut unexpectedly. Still, it's overall a forgiving blade to cut with. The sword weighs 1,333 grams, or 1 ounce shy of 3 pounds, with a 31-inch blade and an overall length of 43 inches. For a sword of this size, it's about medium weight, not overweight by any stretch of the imagination, yet not particularly light and nimble either, typical for windlass swords. As I mentioned earlier, cold steel's new design lengthens the grip to 8 inches. This increases the lever not only for the user, but also for pommel's counterweight effect. The center of balance is now at 2.5 inches from the guard. This makes the sword incredibly easy to maneuver, yet the short blade length and the inconsequential distal taper really gives a strange vibe when the user handles the sword. If we look at the characteristics of the blade, we can understand some of the reasons for this. Although cold steel clearly asked Windlass to increase the blade length and introduce some modest distal tapering, in my opinion, Windlass only improved slightly on both fronts, presumably to save costs. We understand that distal tapering is crucially important to the mass distribution on sword blades. This is why almost all swords around the world throughout human history always feature blades thicker at the base and thinner near the tip. As long as the blade is above a certain length, combined with the profile taper, this makes swords handle in a way that is fast to accelerate near the tip, but still rigid near the guard and carry certain heft. If we look at the profile of this blade, its width starts at a whopping 68.4 millimeters at the base and tapers progressively down to 48.7 millimeters halfway along the blade and 23.5 millimeters at 2 inches from the tip. This sword is inspired by Oakeshott type XVIIIa and XVIIIc swords, which were popular around the first half of the 15th century, especially in Italian states. I originally recorded a prolonged explanation of the Oakeshott typology in its historical context, but here I decide to be concise instead. The diamond cross-section and the gentle profile taper on this sword matches the Type 18 archetype. The length of this blade falls into the subtype of XVIIIa, which denotes a class of shorter hand-and-a-half sword, while the extra broad blade width conforms to the subtype XVIIIc. Both of these types belong to the cut and thrust sword category, given that by the early 15th century, knights and men-at-arms had already encased themselves in incredibly protective full-plate harness. So, a rigid blade and an acute point to jab in between the articulated plates was the way to go against these heavily armored combatants. Yet cuts were still essential at dispatching loads of lower-ranked common soldiers wearing gambesons, aka padded textile armor, and some piecemeal plates. In my opinion, the transitional geometry towards the tip on this sword doesn't support that well enough. Compared to the original sword at Metropolitan Museum, but this is a lesser flaw. The real Achilles heel of this sword is the inadequate distal taper on the blade. Type 18A and 18C swords usually start at 5 to 6 mm thickness at the base and taper down to around 3 mm near the tip. This guarantees a good rigidity of the blade and certain handling characteristics, such as the rotational inertia. This sword, however, starts at 4 mm at the base and indeed tapers down somewhat in the first third of the blade and stay most of that thickness until the final transition to the tip. Therefore, on the first half of this blade, the thickness is inadequate. This directly causes the blade to be floppier than desired, which leads to difficult thrust, a less severe issue for a competition cutting sword, but also makes cuts unpredictable, which is definitely a sin to participant of any sort of contest. Of course, a thin blade also makes cuts generally easier. The flat ground diamond cross-section ensures that, and the secondary bevel isn't a huge issue as it ensures some edge durability by adding some material behind the edge. Some apple seed geometry to blend in the secondary bevel into the primary one will be nice, but at this price point, you can only expect so much. The fit and finish have Windlass written all over. Nothing dreadfully wrong, yet corners are cut to skip the cosmetic appeal to emphasize on the functionality. Scoping down the blade, you can clearly see the central ridge isn't arrow straight. Yet, even with the inconsistency, it tries to keep the symmetry of the blade mostly on point. Both edges are mostly straight, without perceivable warping. The very modern mirror polish on the flat ground bevels shows some excessive rippling, but not to the point that would affect the performance in any shape or form. Even with the slightly ahistorical tip geometry, the profile generally seems to be falling into acceptable parameters. And at a distance, nothing looks particularly wrong, and it's even quite handsome, to be frank, despite the fact that the short blade throws the proportion a bit off with that very long hilt. The blade is made of 1050 steel, which is borderlining on medium carbon, a very unusual choice for both cold steel and Windlass products. It's a relatively soft steel, given it's only 0.5% of carbon content, but you can argue that this makes sharpening easier. I did notice that it takes minimal effort to hone the edges back to adequate sharpness. The fit of the blade on the crossguard is, as usual for Windlass swords, atrocious. A gaping hole with a rectangular gap, ignoring completely the cross-section of the blade, and a copious amount of black substance, presumably epoxy or some kind of glue, holding the blade in place. The shape of the crossguard isn't bad at all. It doesn't have the complex geometries and crisp edges found on high-end swords, obviously, but it conforms well to the shape of the original sword at the Met, with rounded edges to avoid discomfort, which is thoughtful. The central ridge on the guard improves aesthetics, as well as aiding the thumb grip on the blade. The guard's width and the thickness is adequate, but not overly chunky. The grip is the usual Windlass grip with shiny modern leather, very prominent stitch lines, and bulky risers. While it doesn't win in the aesthetics department, it checks all the right boxes in the ergonomic aspects. It has a very nice waisted geometry and nice flat sections on both sides of the grip to aid edge alignment. The leather offers good traction without being rough. The risers keep both of your hands in place, and they're not abrasive. Its overall oblong cross-section complies well with the dimension of both guards and the pommel. There's no jarring transition at all. Moving on to the pommel, its shape and geometry is very characteristic to cold steel designs. It's vaguely historical, combining scentstopper type to a somewhat flattened type called the fishtail. The resulting aesthetic is interestingly unusual while being rather ergonomic as well, providing a continuation of the grip so your offhand can comfortably hold on to the pommel partially. The shape combined with a long grip offers a generous 9.5 inches overall gripping space, although if the blade was longer, the user could truly utilize that great leverage to its maximum potential. The edges on the pommel, while not chamfered, are rounded so they wouldn't hurt your hand. The high satin finish on the pommel and the crossguard is consistent, which looks better than the mirror polish on the blade, if you ask me. They seem to be made of mild steel, as they tend to take on a patina or gather rust spots if you don't keep them oiled. It's not without fault. The way the pommel is secured, well, you can see it's not a nut, it's not pinned, but screwed. Seriously? Well, combined with the innovative shape of this pommel, well, it's quite unfortunate, isn't it? My wife has an opinion on this pommel, and which I'm not at liberty to share. But you can guess. It looks very secure though. Overall, I would say the fit and finish meets the expectation and standard of a sub $300 sword. The overall dimension of the sword is attractive and uncommon. The biggest downfall of the sword is the thickness and the distal taper on the blade, which would eventually affect my assessment of this sword. True to almost all windlass swords, this sword comes with a sheath instead of a scabbard as advertised. Keep in mind that a scabbard would have a rigid wooden core with leather work on top. This, however, is made entirely of hard leather, which fortunately isn't overly floppy. The leather is the shiny black one that matches the wrapping of the grip, even that prominent stitch line. Because it lacks a rigid wooden core, the sheath features a metal locket and a chape to prevent the blade from cutting through when it's drawn. The shape of the locket and the chape is identical to the ones on the old Arbedo model, but Cold Steel requested some bells and whistles, so now they both have decorative carving on the surfaces, which look rather decent. The shape of the locket also matches the central ridge of the crossguard. It's a relatively snug fit without being too tight. One problem is that some kind of white powder kept getting rubbed onto the blade when it's unsheathed, presumably due to the way the leather was treated. After several months, this problem eventually subsided. So as a final verdict, does this make a competent package of a competition-level cutting sword? Well, unfortunately, no. Not if you want to do well in any competition, in which you will be pitted against championship-level swordsmen armed with the likes of Albion, Principe, XIIIa, and Angus trim Type 12A6. Sure, it will allow you to have some kicks out of such an event, for perhaps a participation trophy. In the spirit of competition, you need to bring your A game, which is not only math skills, but also a very adequate cutting sword. This sword, on the other hand, can be a useful practicing tool. For $280, that's the amount I paid. It's an overall handsome looking package, with a blade geometry conducive to cutting. It is somewhat forgiving to bad cuts, having the adequate durability. Also, the hardness enables you to practice sharpening on the edges, which is a handy skill in the long run. If you find one readily available for under $300, I encourage you to pick it up, as it does offer some price advantage over its competitor with this blade type, such as the Purple Heart Armory competition cutting sword and the RK European line number 3, the Harriet Dean sword, and the XIIIa sword by Dark Sword Armory. With all things considered, I would give this sword a 7 out of 10. I hope this review has been helpful. If you do enjoy it, please like and subscribe, and I will see you in year 2 of my channel.